Hello everyone. In this video you're going to learn about CSS. Now if you're watching this video, I'm going to assume that you've written your first CSS rule before, right? Like you've said color orange or background color yellow. In this video though, you're actually going to learn how to build something that looks like this. So this is like my standard page area, and then notice this purple background area has a grid, like a 2-column layout. Like it actually looks like something cohesive, something nice. So how in the world would we write CSS to create this fun experience? You see there's, transitions on hover. The image is sort of zooming in and rotating. We've got hover effects. How would you set this up? So in this video, you're just going to walk through this line by line, typing out the code with me, and I'll try to explain my thought process and what the different properties do and just how to set this up. So if that sounds like something that's fun for you or that you think there might be some educational value, let's jump right into the action. Now, in terms of where I'm going to be typing out my code, I just want to let you know this video is actually a series or a playlist on my channel where we're learning all about WordPress development, so coding within the world of WordPress. In other words, if you dig back a few videos on my channel, you'll find a video where I show you how to set up VS Code, how to set up a local development copy of WordPress, and we're actually in the middle of creating our own new block type or plugin, with our own code that we are in complete control of. So in our previous video, we learned how to use PHP to loop through and output, like one link per custom post type per pet. In this video, we're just going to dig into writing CSS to make it actually look nice. Because as of our last video, this is what it looks like. This isn't very compelling, right? So the whole point of this video is how would you use CSS to turn this instead into this? Cool. So if you are following along on this WordPress series and playlist and journey, just to refresh your memory, how do I open up this folder? Well, from your local WP installation, you would click Site Folder here. And just to run through this one more time with you, you go into the app folder and then the public folder and then the WP content folder, then the plugins folder. And remember, we created this brand new folder called Our Amazing Plugin, and that's where all these files live. So those are the files that you're going to see me editing in VS Code for the remainder of this video. So as of right now though, let's in VS Code, with that folder open, we do need to be sure to open up our terminal. So that's Control J or Command J, and you do need to say npm start. Without this, your changes will not show up in the browser. Cool, but with that running, let's go into the src folder and jump into render.php. If we scroll down just a little bit, currently we're only showing big dogs, like pet types that are of the dog species whose weight is over 9. What if we just want to show all animals so that we have like more cards or pets to work with? So really quick to change that, you could just comment out these queries. So leave post type as pet, but then you can like comment out these lines. So if you just drag and select, on Windows you can press Control and then /. On Mac it's Command and /. And then you could also, you could have selected this all at once, but if you just select that, comment it out, and then hit save and refresh, now you're not filtering based on weight and species, we're just showing all pets. The idea of why I commented this out is because you might want this back a little bit later on, so this way you didn't lose the code, like you still have it here for reference, but it's no longer actively being applied. Cool. Let's get to the point of this video though, which is HTML, but specifically CSS, right? How in the world can we take this and instead make it look like this? The first thing I would start with is the overall div that gives it this purple background color. So this is what we're working with. Let's find that in our PHP or HTML. So in render.php, we have the loop right around line 25, but any HTML that's in here is going to get repeated once for each pet. I want just one wrapper div that houses all of those. So in other words, in between this if line and this while line, so right about here in between those two lines, I'm going to have the start of a wrapper div. However, right now where my cursor is, I'm in PHP mode, not HTML mode. So what I would do is at the end of this line, I would exit PHP with ? Greater than, and then right at the start of the while line, just go back into PHP mode. And then right here, we can just have a div. Let's give it a class of, and then I'm just making this up, but just so we're on the same page, why don't we call it like pet cards? And then we would want to close this div after the loop. So this is where the while loop ends. So I would exit out of PHP right there. And then on this line, we can go back into PHP. So then right here, I'm free to be in HTML and just close out that div. Let's save this. And now let's go write a little bit of CSS for pet cards. So in our style.scss, we can just down at the very bottom, set up a new rule, pet. So dot to select a class, pet dash cards. And let's just say background color purple. Let's save that. If we refresh, cool. However, you might notice in the version that we're trying to copy, we would want it to take up the full available width of the screen, not be confined to this sort of blog post inner content area. Now, the quickest way around that has to do with the fact that I'm using the 2025 theme. In the 2025 theme, check it out. You can just give it a second class. So in the quotes for class, we can say space. And if you just say align full, all one word, align full, hit save, refresh, that gets you the full available width. Now, how would you fine tune this color? Because that's probably not the purple we want. We want this shade of purple. Back in VS Code in your CSS, if you hover over that value of purple, this menu appears, and now you can click and drag the exact shade that you want. If you want to copy along with me exactly though, my RGB value is 180, 183, and 211. So if we save that, refresh, cool. Let's give it a bit of padding though. So like there should be some padding at the top. And then let's also give it a maximum width. So like we don't want to be confined to this width, but maybe, you know, if someone has like a 40-inch monitor, we don't want the content all the way to the edges. So let's give it a maximum width and maybe some padding. So if we just say like padding, maybe like 60px and 20px. So this will be 60 vertically and 20 horizontally. You can see that it looks good vertically. It comes in from the sides a little bit. This would make sense like on a smartphone if you were scrolling. You want a little bit of space before the edges. But now to create a maximum width value and have it be centered, I would actually just create an inner wrapper div. So let me show you what I have in mind here. Back in our HTML, on this line where we have the opening div, just literally right after that, I would have another opening div nested inside of it. And let's give that a class of like pet cards inner. And then you would also want to include an extra closing div here. And then we can just create a rule for that. So dot pet cards inner. And just give it a max width of maybe like 960 pixels. And then to tell it to be centered horizontally, you just say margin with a value of 0 and auto. So 0 vertically, and then for horizontally, left and right, auto will center it. So if you refresh, cool. Next up, I'd want them to sit 2 per row, right? Like in a 2-column grid. So like, you know, one goes here and then another one goes here. So to set that up, I would use display grid. So on pet cards inner, we can just say display grid, and then grid template columns. Now, let me show you the easiest way would just be to say 1FR, 1FR, semicolon. That already gets you a 2-column grid, and then you could add a bit of gap. So you could also say like a gap of 20px, hit save, refresh. So that's already looking pretty good. However, what about on a small screen like a smartphone? So here we have a smaller window that's, you know, simulating like a smartphone, and I can let you know there's probably not enough horizontal space to fit 2 per row. So what if on a screen that's of this size, we want just 1 per row, and then on a larger screen, we want 2 per row? Here's a neat little trick. In the past, you would have had to write a media query and have a breakpoint, but with grid, display grid, there's this really cool trick where for grid template columns, get rid of 1FR, 1FR, and instead we're going to say repeat, parentheses to call the repeat CSS function. Inside of it, we're going to give it 2 values. So A comma B. The first value, instead of the A placeholder, is auto-fit. And then the second value, instead of B, we're going to call min max, parentheses to call that, and give that 2 values. So A comma B. Instead of the placeholder A, let's say like 350 pixels. And then instead of the placeholder B, say 1FR. So altogether, this is going to repeat something. And what is it going to repeat? It's going to repeat an element that needs to have a minimum size of 350 pixels wide. The maximum it can be is to take up the full available width. And then how many times is it going to repeat that? Just an automatic amount, like based on the available size. So if you save that and refresh, on the large screen, we still have 2 per row. But if I refresh on this screen that's small, now we only have 1 per row. This is a really nice way to handle responsive designs. We didn't have to write a breakpoint or a media query. I'm a big fan of this approach. At this point, now let's start working on the actual pet cards themselves, like each pet item. Or I guess before we get to that, let's add this fun our pets area that has this cool text shadow. So back in our render.php file, I just realized if we want to have room for a heading above where the pet cards begin, we're going to need to change our HTML structure a bit. Because what I mean by this is, see how we have these two divs before the while loop begins? Well, essentially after this inner div, like below that, this is where you could have, right, like your heading level 2 that says our pets. But then we don't want that to be a part of the 2-column grid. So what I would probably do then is after this heading level 2, that's where I would create one more wrapper div and give it a class of maybe like pet cards grid. And then just have a third and closing div down here. So closing div. So now what I would do is save that, but now we need to move these grid properties onto a new rule called pet cards grid. So just move over display grid, grid template columns, and gap. Just cut and paste that into this rule instead. And let's save that and see what that gets us. Oops, back in this window. Cool. So in other words, this element is not a part of that 2-column grid flow. Perfect. Let's start styling our heading level 2 now so that it has this cool text shadow and the correct size. So we need to be able to select it. So here it is, a heading level 2. I would probably give it a class of like our hero text, just so I can select only that specific text, and then just a new rule dot our hero text. The first thing I would do is zero out its margins, but in terms of like bottom margin, we would want a little bit. So there's this cool shorthand where you can set all 4 values moving clockwise, like top, right, bottom, left. So in other words, instead of having to say like margin top 0 and then like margin right and then margin bottom, you can instead, if you just say margin, you can give it 4 different values. So let's say like 0 on the top, 0 on the right, maybe 20 px on the bottom, and 0 on the left. Cool. Let's make sure that it uses white. So the hexadecimal color, you could just say white, but the hexadecimal code is hashtag and then 3 Fs. Let's make sure that it's bold. So font weight bold. Let's bump up the font size a ton. Let's say like 4.2 rem. And then let's give it a text shadow. So text shadow. Let's say come down from the top 3 pixels, come in from the left 3 pixels. We don't want any blur, so 0 blur. And then you have to give it a color. So you could select the exact color you want by hovering over this and, clicking and dragging. If you want to follow along with me, this is the exact RGB, which stands for red, green, blue value I'm using. So 38, 48, and 189. But what's a cool trick is if you want to make it a little bit see-through or transparent, instead of RGB, you can say RGBA, which the A stands for alpha transparency. And now you can provide another comma and say like .4, and this will now be 40% visible. So it's a little bit see-through. So let's save that. And if I refresh, cool. From this point forward, let's start working on the actual pet cards themselves. In other words, each item should also be a 2-column grid, right? The first column is their photograph, and then the second column has their text information. So here's how I would set that up. Back in our render.php file, currently each animal is just a div with a class of our pet, and then a heading level 2 with a link inside it. Let's do this. Let's cut that heading level 2 line. And so inside the div, I want to have 2 nested divs. The first can be the left-hand column, and then the other one is the right-hand column. So let's say div dot, and let's say like our pet photo, hit tab. And then below that, so even after the closing div, let's have another div. So div dot, let's call it like our pet text and hit tab. Cool. So this is the second column. So inside that div sandwich, you can drop down and paste in your clipboard. Let's change that to be a heading level 3 instead of a heading level 2. And then still in that div, but below the heading level 3, let's have their excerpt, right? So if you look at this area, like their little bit of text, we can pull in like the first 14 or 20 words or whatever from their body content. And then we can have a link that says learn more. So to do that, let's have a paragraph, so P and then hit tab, and inside of it, let's jump into PHP. You can close out of PHP. Inside of PHP mode, we're going to call a function named WP underscore trim underscore words, parentheses to call that. And now this is going to return a value, but it's not going to actually output it onto the page. So right before that, we do want to be sure to include echo. This outputs whatever this value returns or is. Inside these parentheses, when we're calling this function, we give it two things, so a comma b as placeholders. Instead of a, the first thing is the content that you're trying to trim. So this would just be get the content, parentheses to call it, and then the second argument is how many words you're wanting to display. So let's only display like the first 14 words. So if we save that and refresh, cool, there you see the first 14 words, and then it automatically adds the ... Then still inside that paragraph, but after this block of code, let's have a link that says like what, read more or learn more. It looks like learn more. So you can just hit A and hit tab. That creates an A element. Inside the A sandwich, this is the text that you would click on. So this is where you would just say learn more. If you wanted a fun little arrow symbol, you could say ampersand RAQUO semicolon. If you save and refresh, that just creates this little arrow icon symbol. And then for the actual value for when you click on one in this href, this would be, you'd go into PHP mode, close out of PHP, and then just say the underscore permalink, parentheses to call it. So you can save that, refresh. Now when I click on learn more, like for example for woof, it takes me to that individual screen. Let me go back. Cool. Let's go ahead and output their image in that first empty div, right? So this div that we gave a class of our pet photo, inside that div sandwich, let's have a link, so A, so that you can click on it. And again, the href value, you would go into PHP and you would just say the permalink so that when you click on it. But inside the A sandwich, this is where we would want the actual photograph or image file. So inside of WordPress, to do that, you would just go into PHP mode, and then there's a function called the post thumbnail, parentheses to call it. Now, if you don't give it a value in these parentheses, the image is going to be really large, like way, way, way too large. You can see I have to scroll really far. So instead, in these parentheses, you can say quotes, and then let's just give it a value of medium. And if you save and refresh, you get the idea. That way you're not forcing your visitors to download like a 4 megabyte JPEG. So this is the perfect size. Now we can use CSS from this point to create the 2-column grid and get everything sized perfectly. So here's how I would do that. Currently, each pet is this overall wrapper class of our pet. So I'm going to find that in our CSS. If you don't have that yet, you could just create a new rule. But for me, I already have our pet. So I would just tell it to use display grid, and then grid template columns. And now if you wanted them to be 2 equal width columns, you say 1FR, 1FR, right? Like if you wanted 3 equal width columns, another space FR. However, if we don't want a perfect 50-50 split, like if we want the first column to be a specific width, we can just say, like 140 px, and then let the other column take up any and all remaining space. So this is really cool. You can mix and match fixed values with flexible values. So if I save that and refresh, well, good news and bad news. We have the 2-column layout, but we need to tell the image to sort of squish or shrink wrap to fit within the available div that it's living in. So first of all, let's tell the image to not be able to overflow the div that it's in. That won't actually resize the image. It'll just sort of hide this extra area. And then after that, I'll show you how to actually resize it. So what I would do is just create a new rule. And remember, we called that div, what is it? What did we call it? Our pet photo. So I would say our pet photo. Tell it to use overflow hidden. So that you can see now the image is not allowed to like overflow the parent div. And now let's tell the image to take up like the exact amount of space. For example, see how this barks a lot image is completely cut off? Like the sizing of the image doesn't make sense for the container and the size that it's in. So here's how you would fix that. I would just have a new rule that's targeting the actual IMG image element. So I would say .our pet photo, look inside it for the IMG element, and tell its width to be 100% and its height to be 100%. And now you might be thinking, isn't that going to stretch the image like unnaturally so that the aspect ratio looks messed up? So if we save that and refresh, yes, you'd be correct. That is messing up the aspect ratio. However, in the modern world of CSS, we have a nice little tool in the toolbox for this exact situation. We just say object fit and set it to cover. If I save that and refresh, awesome. From this point, let's give the card as a whole, or like the pet item as a whole, a background color, and then also give it like rounded edges. So here's what I would do. Let's find our overall rule like this. Our pet. So I would say like background color, white, and let's say border radius 16 pixels to get rounded edges. Cool, but you can see if you zoom in that the pet photo div is allowed to overflow that element that we just gave rounded edges to. So I would also tell our pet to have overflow hidden. Perfect. While we're at it, let's also give that overall div a really subtle shadow. So box shadow, let's say 2 pixels in from the top, 2 pixels in from the left, a 3 pixel blur. And then the RGBA code for black is just 0, 0, 0. But notice I said RGBA, so the fourth value can be like how visible you want it to be. Let's just say 0.08, like 8% visible. Cool, it's really subtle, but I like that. I'm not liking the border though. In our previous video, we added this, right? Border 1 pixel solid gray. Let's absolutely get rid of that. That's messing up the entire look. So if I refresh, cool. At this point, we just need to start styling this text column area. So let's jump back into our CSS, and maybe right below our pet photo, we can just say like dot our pet. I believe we named it our pet text, right? Yes, our pet text. So curly brackets, let's say padding 20px. So that alone gives us this. Now let's adjust the margin for the heading level 3. So dot our pet text, look inside it for heading level 3. Let's get rid of all margin in every direction, except let's leave a little bit on the bottom, maybe like 8px. Let's set the font size to 1.2 rem. Let's make sure to give it a font weight of bold. Cool. Let's bump down the size of this paragraph text. So just a new rule, our pet text, look inside it for any P elements and say font size. Let's go with like 0.9 rem. Just bump it down a little bit. I think that looks a lot better. And now let's select any links in this entire div. You can see over here and make them purple. And also remove the default underline. So to do that, we can just say our pet text, look inside it for any A elements. Let's say color purple and text decoration none. If you want my exact shade instead of just purple, it's RGB and then 38, 48, 189. So you can refresh. Cool. And then when you hover over one of these links, let's bring the underline back and maybe use a darker shade of purple. So to do that, you would just say our pet text A element, but say :hover. This is called a pseudo selector. Like you're selecting just the specific state of an element. And then you could just say text decoration underline, and then the exact shade of purple. So color : if you want to use the exact same as me, it's 22, 31, 150, semicolon. So we can save, refresh. Now when I hover over them, they get darker and the underline appears. Cool. At this point, you might be noticing that our images are not sort of shrink wrapping to the amount of text in the right-hand column. Whereas in this example that I'm trying to copy, notice how it's the text column that's dictating the overall height of the pet card as a whole, and then the image sort of just squishes vertically to fit. So it's up to you. You might actually prefer this look where the image gets to set the height instead of the text. But notice up here, like these images are quite tall. So then there's this extra space in the text column. If you didn't want that, here's the quickest way that I would set that up. So I would find our photo column, our pet photo, and I would set it to use position relative. And then I would just tell the image element to use position absolute. As soon as you save that and refresh, notice when you make something use position absolute, you're taking it out of the flow, the natural flow of the document. So it's almost as if the image doesn't exist any longer. So then this column is dictating the overall height, and then using height and width, we're just telling the image like fill up the space of your nearest relative ancestor. So that's a nice way. It's up to you which column you want to let dictate the height, but I think this looks really uniform and really nice. At this point, all we have left is a little bit of fun for when you hover over. Let's set it up so that when you hover over any part of the entire card, like even if you don't hover over the image, even if I hover right here, let's have the image zoom in and rotate, and let's not just have it happen immediately, let's animate it or transition it. So to do that, we just go back into our code, and I'm looking for the rule for our pet card as a whole, yes. So then right below that, I just say our pet : hover, and then look inside of that. So if you hover over anywhere in that entire parent div, look inside that for our pet photo image, curly brackets, and now we can just say transform, and now we can spell out a few different CSS functions. So scale, be sure to end that line with a semicolon. The scale function, just as you guessed it, 1 is its natural size, so anything above 1 would be increasing its size, and anything below 1, so like 0.9 would be decreasing the size. Why don't we set it to like 1.4, right? So it should be like 40% larger than its natural size. And then we can also call the rotate, helps if you spell it correctly, the rotate function. And let's rotate it just 6 degrees. So you have to say, obviously, what number you want, but then DEG. So let's save that and refresh. And now when I hover over any one of the cards, I mean, that's the exact look I want, but we don't want it to happen all at once. We want to animate it in between its natural state and that state. So all you do is just go and find the baseline selector for our image. So if you scroll down just a little bit right here, our pet photo image, just give that a rule, a property of transition. First, you tell it which property you're wanting to sort of fade between. So that would be the transform property. Then you tell it how long you want it to take. So let's say like 1/3 of a second. So dot or period 3s. And then if you don't want it to just happen in a linear format, like if you want it to start slow and then speed up and then slow down again, you can say ease in out. Be sure to end that with a semicolon. If you save and refresh, awesome. Now when you hover over the card, it's a nice smooth transition or animation. Now for one final detail, let's also set it up so that if you hover over anywhere on the card, instead of white, what if we transition this to like a really light purple? So to set that up, I would just look for our, again, this rule of just our pet, and then just right below it, just set up our pet :hover, curly brackets, and I'm just going to overrule this background color. So I'll just say background color. Now, if you want to select your exact shade of purple, you can, but if you want to copy me, I'm using this RGB value, 232, 234, and 255, semicolon. Now that's going to happen all at once, but if you wanted that to be like a really slow transition, in the base rule, be sure to have a semicolon on that last line. You would say transition the background color property over the span of like, let's say it should take a full second. So 1s, ease in, out, semicolon. If we save and refresh, notice that's a nice, really long, I mean, you wouldn't want it to be a second. I'm just showing you that's how you can customize it. You would probably only want it to be like half a second. You get the idea though, it's up to you. And then one final detail before we bring this video to a close, and this has nothing to do with CSS, but you might have noticed that in the version I'm copying, it shows the pet's weight value, their custom field, in their text or their title headline. So how would we add that to ours? Simple. Let's dig into our code back in render.php, and inside our heading level 3, so inside the closing area of this A sandwich, this is the dynamic title value. So then right after that, you could just, these parentheses have nothing to do with code. I'm trying to visually output parentheses, right? So like if I say parentheses X and refresh, you get the idea. Only I don't want to hard code it to X. So in those parentheses, if you look at the example, we're going to say the number of their weight and then hard code, LBS. So let's say X and then a space and then LBS. Again, only instead of X, this is where you would go into PHP and close out of PHP. And then it's as simple as just saying the underscore field. And in these parentheses, we have a field, so quotes, that has a name of weight. So if I save that and refresh this version, awesome. Instead of the placeholder X, now we see that real dynamic value for each pet. That is going to bring this video to a close. Hopefully this gave you a fun example of how if you're coding, you are in 100% control of the exact styling and data and everything, every aspect of what you're trying to accomplish. Now, where do we go from here? In our very next lesson, we're going to dig into the fun, but also maybe scary or intimidating world of JavaScript. The idea is that HTML controls the raw content, CSS controls the styling, and JavaScript controls the behavior. For example, like what if you wanted an interactive widget where it converts temperatures between Celsius and Fahrenheit? And so as soon as a user types into a little field and types in a number, what if you wanted to on the fly, like in the next millisecond, show that temperature in Celsius or Fahrenheit right here? So in situations where you don't want to wait for the server to send over data and you want to have something be interactive, if you want to change the behavior, that's where JavaScript comes into play. And that's exactly what we're going to learn about in the next video in this series. Now, at the end of this video, if you're enjoying this series and you want to help support this channel, the best way is to visit my website, learnwebcode.com. From there, you'll find links to my Patreon. The Patreon has various perks. like you'll get your name included in the closing credits of each video. Also, you'll get a downloadable zip for the source code of what we're working on. You can vote on upcoming topics. I also have many different courses available, both on Udemy and Teachable. If you're looking for web hosting for your WordPress projects, I've personally used DreamHost for the last 19 years in my real life, and I've had great experiences. If you use my link to DreamHost, I will receive compensation for sending new users their way. That's a great way to support this channel. You can join my newsletter, you can follow me on various social media, and that's about it. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. I hope you feel like you learned something, and stay tuned for the next video. This video was made possible by my supporters on Patreon and YouTube memberships. I don't have any producers yet, but your name could go here. But I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to Rodney, David, Lena's, Demetris, and Kenneth for being sponsor tier members over on Patreon. Really appreciate that support. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.